Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the IPA Power Hour on the state of wind energy. I am Megha Hamal. I am the Chief Strategy and Communications Officer for the Illinois Power Agency, and I will be responsible for hosting the webinar today. To get started, let's go over some housekeeping items. To reduce any background noise, we have muted all participants upon entry. We will be taking questions towards the end, but please feel free to submit your questions throughout the webinar. You can do that by simply clicking the chat function at the bottom of the Zoom panel. Today's session is being recorded, and a copy of the recorded session and the presentation will be available on the IPA website under About IPA Events. At the end of the webinar, as I mentioned, we will be taking the questions from our attendees, but we will also be reserving 10 to 15 minutes for our Acting Director, Brian Granahan, to provide high-level updates of 2023 IPA accomplishments and top agency initiatives for 2024. We hope you can stick around. Today's webinar, The State of Wind Energy, is for general education purpose only and does not represent a legal interpretation or statement of policy by the IPA or its staff. This 90-minute webinar will provide an overview of wind energy development on national and state levels, including benefits, barriers, and trends. The session will also address market feedback and discuss proposals for increasing wind project participation in Illinois. Those who are new to our IPA Power Hour webinar series, I just want to do a quick intro of our Power Hour webinars. Power Hour is a series of educational and informative presentation on a wide range of clean energy topics and emerging issues. We started the Power Hour webinar series in 2021 when the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act was enacted to inform our stakeholders of CEJA-related activities and the implementation of those activities by the agency. The Power Hour webinar series got really popular. So to date, we have hosted 28 webinars and have invited energy thought leaders and experts locally and nationally. This is our last webinar of the year. We will resume our Power Hour webinar series again in February 2024. This is a really quick overview of who we are as an agency. The Illinois Power Agency is an independent state agency created in 2007 by Illinois law. We are responsible for the development of annual electricity procurement plan for customers of electric utilities. We also support the Illinois Renewable Portfolio Standard, which is public policy designed to increase the implementation of renewables in the state. And the IPA supports the RPS through multiple ways by developing the long-term renewable resources procurement plan every other year, through competitive procurements for large utility scale projects, and through solar incentive programs for homes and businesses. Now, let's welcome our esteemed speakers for today's session. Our first speaker for the session is Sean Brady. Sean is the Senior Counsel and Director of Regulatory Advocacy at the Clean Grid Alliance. As an expert in utility regulatory analysis and renewable energy, Sean utilizes his 16 years of industry experience to manage renewable energy policy for states across the Midwest. Sean also manages renewable energy policy and advocacy in planning committees at MISO, a regional transmission organization. Welcome, Sean. Our next
Sure, thank you very much. Sorry.
No, you're fine. Our next speaker is Brian Granahan, the Acting Director of the Illinois Power Agency. As the Acting Director, Brian oversees the development and implementation of the agency's annual procurement plans and capacity procurements, as well as the long-term renewable resources procurement plan. Previously, Brian served as the IPA's Chief Legal Counsel, beginning with the agency in April 2014. In this role, he oversaw a variety of legal, policy, and strategic responsibilities for the IPA, including serving as the agency's legislative liaison and representative in negotiations around the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act and the Future Energy Jobs Act. Welcome, Brian. Our next speaker is Ben Chi. Ben is the Senior Management Director at NERA Economic Consulting. NERA is also the Procurement Administrator for the IPA. Ben is a climate and sustainability expert with extensive knowledge on procurement options, renewable portfolio standards, certification requirements, and more. Additionally, Ben has worked internationally on decarbonization efforts and fossil fuel retirements. Welcome, Ben. And our final speaker is Chris Congo, the Senior Director of Government Affairs for Apex Clean Energy, a leading clean energy company that develops and operates wind, solar, and battery storage facilities nationwide. In his role, Chris focuses on state energy policy to facilitate the development of renewable energy across the Midwest region. Chris works with policymakers, regulators, and coalition partners to help build a clean energy future. Welcome, Chris. Now I would like to welcome our first speaker, Sean, to kick off the presentation by giving an overview on the state of wind energy. Sean, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you. Can you move to my first slide? Thanks. So next slide, please. I'm going to start my presentation with a recent article or prediction by Reuters. I don't know if people have seen this. Reuters is predicting that U.S. wind power is on course to surpass coal's energy production in the U.S. by 2024, 2025. In my slide is a chart created by Reuters comparing monthly energy output of coal to that of wind. The black line on top is coal, and the yellow line on the bottom is wind, and it covers a period of time from January 2015 to September 2023. At the beginning, in January of 2015, coal energy production was about 7.5 times that of wind. Now, in 2023, it is approximately 0.5 times that of wind. In addition, in April of this year, which is highlighted in a red circle on the chart, there was a brief period of time in which wind's energy output across the U.S. exceeded that of coal. So today, I'm going to review the factors affecting wind development, both barriers and opportunities across the U.S., but mostly here in the Midwest region. Next slide, please. So the factors affecting wind development primarily are clean energy and the renewable portfolio standards. There are 23 states plus DC and Puerto Rico that have 100% clean energy goals, which total about 53% of the population in the United States. But that information can be looked up and you can review that online. What I'm going to focus on are those topics in orange: supply chain and economic conditions, the demand for clean energy, siting and permitting policies, both at state and RTO that are affecting wind development, as well as transmission and how that's needed to reduce congestion, to improve the delivery of wind and all clean energy resources to market, as well as improving reliability and flexibility of the grid. Next slide, please. So the first topic I'm going to look at is domestic content of a wind turbine. Primarily, that focuses on the tower, the nacelle, and the nacelle is that minibus looking thing on top of a tower that holds the turbine and the blade, as well as the generator. And then there's also the blades. Those are primarily manufactured here in the United States. As you can see from this chart, it's comparing the domestic product for the nacelle, tower, and blade to actual annual installs of wind projects across the United States. Domestically, we can produce a sufficient amount of towers and nacelles. They dropped a bit, not unsurprisingly, due to COVID, but they are sufficient to cover near-term needs as well as the forecasted growth that's in the gold bars. Blade production dropped the most, but they have the capability to meet near-term demands, and may have already done that for 2023. They all have to add some, based on this forecast, they all have to add a little bit of production capability for later 2020s, but it's manageable in terms of domestic content. But not all of the components of a wind turbine are domestically manufactured. Next slide, please. Various generator components from across the globe. This shows countries, or is indicative of the countries that provide turbine generator components. Now, both the domestic and imported manufactured components have been affected by a number of supply chain and economic conditions. Next slide, please. Which I'll focus on here. COVID has affected manufacturing operations, not only domestically, but across the globe. COVID and war, and also wars affected shipping, and wars still affect some of the shipping and transport of our international components. Inflation, we've seen inflation increase 23% since 2022, and since 2019 rather, and that's affected both our production of components both in the U.S. and abroad. There's also, I'm including as an economic factor, the Illinois RPS budget. There has been indications that the RPS budget, under certain scenarios, may have insufficient funds in the next 10 years. That affects the ability to obtain lending for projects. And so there's a need to understand the courses of action the IPA may take if we do reach kind of a budget impasse in the near term. And finally, there's the Federal Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. That is a big benefit to the industry, that extended the production tax for production tax credit for 3 years out to 2025. That will impact the production and the installation of wind projects pretty much out till about 2030. Next slide. On this slide, we're looking at our offtake agreements. Who's demanding wind energy? This looks at it over time from 1998 to 2022. Originally, back in 1998, you can see a lot of the demand was driven by utilities. But now in 2022, if you look at the circle chart, about 44% of demand for wind resources is coming from retail, corporate, and industrial companies, and 33% are coming from utilities. So we have a nice diverse universe of off-takers at this point, and we don't see that changing much in the future. Next slide. This slide talks about siting and permitting issues both at the state and RTO levels. The first topic is generation interconnection queues at PJM and MISO. They've seen a dramatic increase in the size of their queue. In MISO, this shows MISO's queue in 2022. It's now much larger than that. It's at 228 gigawatts. They've been large before. This doesn't show it, but in 2018, the queue in MISO was over 100 gigawatts. But they're still grappling with the size of this queue and how to manage restudies of projects that may fall out of the queue. So there's that issue that's slowing development of the ability to interconnect. The second topic is siting. With over 23 states having clean energy goals and renewable portfolio standards, there's a tremendous demand for renewable resources, but siting is usually left to local governments, and local governments have varying standards, and that variation can slow or even impede development. And so for some of the states to reach their goals or standards, they will need to have a stable approach to wind siting, such as recently Illinois, Indiana, and Michigan are examples of states that recently enacted minimum siting standards for their local governments. Next slide. So now we're going to start talking about transmission and the impacts of transmission. This is a map from MISO, the MISO North region. Everything colored in orange, pink, brown, and black, that system those transmission lines are full. You can't really add any new generation without doing extensive network upgrades or adding new transmission lines. Next slide, please. So that's why MISO has a long-range planning initiative. Right now, they're looking at 4 different, what they call tranches, for improving the transmission system that improves for renewables. We need to improve both transfer capacity, improve reliability, improve system flexibility. The MISO is looking at what's shown on the screen right now is the first tranche of transmission lines in Illinois or in MISO. There will be the second tranche will overlay the same area. A third group or tranche of transmission lines will be in MISO South, which includes Texas, Arkansas, Missouri, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And the fourth will be transmission lines that better interconnect the North region to the South region. Next slide, please. So this is more close to home is the Renewable Energy Access Plan that CGA co-drafted. As I noted in my last slide, MISO and PJM already plan transmission across their footprint, and MISO is planning transmission to meet the long-term needs of their states. Illinois has the ability to participate in MISO's and PJM's transmission planning processes. The ICC for over 20 years has regularly participated in MISO and PJM's committees and working groups to influence and assert Illinois' viewpoints on how the regional transmission organizations should operate. So they have a experience already doing that. The purpose of the REAP is to provide an open and transparent process around the inputs that the ICC would provide to PJM and MISO for their transmission expansion planning process, specifically around long-term planning for state policies such as the RPS, which sets targets for wind generation out to 2040. So new transmission infrastructure is needed in Illinois, and the REAP should help focus on how those benefits come to Illinois. That transmission is needed to allow new generation to be built. It also delivers so that the energy from the power from that new generation can be delivered to load centers, meaning the cities in Illinois. It ensures that the overall bulk electric system will continue to operate reliably and with resilience as new generation, including wind, is added. So I thank you for your time. As you can see, there are a number of factors affecting wind development. CGA, its partners, and its members are working hard to help states reach their clean energy goals. And I'm happy to answer questions at the end of our presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Our next speaker is Brian Granahan, IPA Acting Director. Brian will be discussing wind energy in Illinois and development under the RPS and outside of RPS. Brian, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Mega. Thank you as always for pulling this together. And especially thanks to the participants today. I know it's the holidays and there's a lot going on, and we deeply appreciate the time that you've taken to come in and attend this session. And hopefully this will be illuminating. Now, as you'll notice from this cover slide, we talk about wind energy Illinois development under the RPS and outside the RPS. And it's important to note that there are many projects in Illinois developed under the RPS, but many that are not. And there's also projects developed pursuant to the Illinois RPS that may not be located in Illinois. And we'll get into some of that. And so the two populations are not exactly mapping on each other. So as we go to the first slide. So just a brief overview of wind energy development in Illinois. And this is inclusive of RPS projects, non-inclusive RPS projects. It's just looking at our state borders and asking ourselves, how many projects, how much installed capacity do we have statewide? 78 total projects, the project being defined by a certain interconnection point. And you can see how they cluster. You have 22 below 5 megawatts in size, and then you have 47 above 50 megawatts. So you basically have either fairly large projects constituting what we might call a wind farm, as it's multiple turbines at a given site, and you also have maybe small distributed wind projects on the other hand. We hear a lot more about the first of those two, the large wind farms, as they provide a lot more power. Some of the smaller projects are niche use. Many of them date back many years. They're not the sort of thing that you hear a great amount about. This is data pulled from the US Wind Turbine Database. It's important to note that not all of these renewable projects have any obligation to report anything to the IPA. So we have data and information about those projects that participate in the RPS. But if a project does not, we're actually going to EIA, or we're going to a source like a tracking system, or potentially to an RTO's interconnection queue to find out information of those projects, just like all of you are. Statewide, we have the 5th most amount of installed wind energy capacity nationally at 7,780.54 megawatts. 2 points of comparison there. One is to solar photovoltaic capacity, where we're up over 2,200 megawatts of presently installed solar project capacity in Illinois. It's very important to note that just a few years ago, if you go back to when FEJA passed in 2017, and even I think as late as 2018, we only had about 80 megawatts of solar project capacity statewide. So that's grown significantly in the last few years. By contrast, with nuclear power, we have over 11,000 megawatts of nuclear power, focused on just 6 plants and 11 reactors making up those 6 plants. So that gives you some sense of context of the amount of wind energy installed in Illinois relative to a few other generating sources. So you go to the next slide. So this is just a table that we used actually in our annual report on the amount of megawatt hours produced by different renewable energy generating sources. And you can see that in 21-22, wind was by far the most. At this point in time, a lot of solar projects that are online presently were still in the process of being energized. And I think it's important to note with any of these data sources, when you're pulling them, especially for national data sources that are pulling state information, there's often 2 lags built into the process. So this is megawatt hours produced in 21-22, but sometimes the self-reporting from different state entities might have a few months of lag built into it as well. So the numbers right now are probably pretty different, and you'd have a lot more solar megawatt hours being produced. But this should give you some sense of where we are on wind power presently in terms of the overall amount of electricity being produced annually in Illinois. Go to the next slide. So this is a map of wind energy by location. You can see the clustering around central Illinois. As those circles get darker, that constitutes a higher amount of installed capacity. So your largest wind farms have the darkest amount of capacity, and the lightest circles that you see there are those small projects that I'd noted a couple of slides ago. Really want to thank Gabriela Ayala from the IPA for pulling this together and putting together some of our different visualizations on this. I think it's very helpful. One of the things that we'll get into in talking about what the IPA wants to do over the next year is a really exciting clean energy dashboard project where we're trying to pull together a lot of this information and figure out new ways to visualize it. So we're always trying to think about different ways to show these things and illustrate these things and provide interactive maps that can hopefully tell the story of renewable energy development. This is one example of how we can do this. It just gives you a sense of where projects are located. You'll also see that most of them are in MISO in Illinois as well. You think about Interstate 80 as maybe the sort of a rough dividing line between PJM and MISO. You'll see that most of them are actually south of where that would be across the state. So that's something to keep in mind in terms of the mix of energy as between PJM and MISO within Illinois, where you have more wind in central and southern Illinois, but you do have 5 of the 6 nuclear plants in Illinois are located within PJM. Let's go to the next slide. So this gives you a sense of how Illinois has added wind energy capacity by year and where you've had different valleys and different peaks. There are certain trend lines you can take from this, but one of the challenges is that wind farms tend to be very large and lumpy. So when you look at something like a 600 megawatt capacity amount, that might just be 2 projects or might just be 3 projects. So sometimes the data doesn't tell the best story when you're not dealing with such big numbers. Nevertheless, you can see when things began and basically how they've grown over the past. As we'll get into in a bit, we had a bit of a surge in wind project development stemming from some PPAs that the IPA made available back in 2010, and that led to some projects. We've had different procurement events since then to support some projects, but you've also just had a massive amount of merchant projects that are not supported under the Illinois RPS that are reflected in these numbers. I think it's about 2,000 megawatts or so of wind that's supported under the Illinois RPS, and you've got then over 5,000 megawatts that's supported outside of it. So that's something to keep in mind when people talk about the RPS numbers with respect to wind energy in Illinois versus what we have in terms of overall installed capacity. So going then to the next slide. So this is a chart that then tracks solar project development against wind project development on an installed capacity basis. And it gives you a sense for what I was mentioning earlier, that you had wind projects being developed in Illinois and energized 15 years ago, but you really didn't have all that much solar coming online. In fact, that one piece in 2012 was probably the 20 megawatt solar project that came out of our 2010 LTPPAs, but you only had about 80 megawatts of solar statewide as of 2018, just a very, very small amount, especially relative to other states that were aggressively pursuing renewables goals. You did have wind power development in Illinois, though, and obviously you certainly did in neighboring states like Iowa. But in recent years, we've come to see a lot more solar development in this state. And as our renewables mix grows, we've seen solar taking up a much larger share associated with it. This is also true under the Illinois RPS, as we'll get to in a little bit. So this is how things have changed over time. Hopefully going forward, we'll continue to see that wind project share, or at least the amount of wind projects grow, but we're continuing to see that solar amount grow year over year as we're supporting more and more solar photovoltaic projects, both rooftop projects and large utility scale projects. So going to the next slide. So this is an overview of wind energy under the Illinois RPS. For those who aren't familiar, the Illinois RPS has a 40% by 2030 goal and a 50% by 2040 goal. What this means is that we need to meet all of our retail electric sales in Illinois through the procurement of RECs at 40% of that amount by 2030 and 50% of that amount by 2040. There's a parallel requirement found in the different subparagraph that says that 45 million RECs from new projects must be procured by 2030, with a certain share of that coming from wind. The overall percentage, the 40% is about 48 million, so it's a requirement that's not too different from what our goals are generally. Of those RECs, 45% must come from new wind projects. Now, recent legislation modifies that to say wind and also modernize and retool hydropower. We'll get into that a little bit in talking about legislative changes. But the vast, vast, vast majority of that is likely to come from wind. If you back that out, then take that number and say, okay, what does this mean in terms of the overall RECs being delivered annually by 2030? It's just over 20 million RECs being delivered annually by 2030 in order to meet the RPS goals. How do we do that? We do that through competitive procurement events that support the development of new utility scale wind projects. As we get to Ben Shee's presentation coming after mine, he'll explain what that mechanism looks like, how an entity applies, what the maturity requirements are, but it's all these big competitive procurement events modeled loosely off of what we did for energy and capacity procurement as the IPA that we use to support new wind project development. Looking at the balance of RPS versus non-RPS wind energy, it's important to note that most wind projects in Illinois are not selling their RECs through the Illinois RPS, and those thus don't count toward the Illinois RPS. One thing that we do at the IPA is through our annual report, the next version of which will be released on February 15th, we now report on both. So we're not just reporting on RPS projects and the projects being supported under the RPS, but also overall renewables in Illinois, as usually when people talk about RPS projects or RPS progress, they're really talking about the overall share of renewables in Illinois. And for wind, there's a lot more that's happening outside of the RPS than happening within the RPS. One thing to note on solar versus wind is the capacity factor differences. So you might have 55% of RECs coming from solar and 45% coming from wind or wind and new hydropower, but it's very different on an installed capacity basis. The rule of thumb that I always use is to get to 1 million RECs delivered annually from photovoltaic projects, it's about 650 megawatts of new installed capacity because of the lower capacity factor. For wind, it's maybe more like 350 megawatts. What that means is that if you have 500 megawatt or 5 million RECs being delivered annually, let's say, you might only be supporting 1,700 or 1,800 megawatts of new wind projects. So it's pretty different, and it's something to keep in mind that the installed capacity numbers will ultimately differ from the overall delivery numbers. It's also the case that under Section 1-75 C1I of the IPA Act, projects in adjacent states may participate in the Illinois RPS, utility scale solar and utility scale wind projects, and we'll see that in future slides, if they meet certain public interest criteria. Chapter 4 of our long-term plan, which is currently before the ICC, describes how the IPA takes this qualitative criteria in statute and then turns it into a scoring system to assess whether projects from adjacent states do in fact qualify for the Illinois RPS. And we've seen a handful of projects that are located in adjacent states that do qualify for the Illinois RPS wind REC delivery contracts. Another thing I just want to point out as a difference between wind and solar is land use considerations. A rule of thumb that we have in giving estimates back on land use is that for 1 megawatt of wind, you might be looking at 80 acres of land. By contrast, for 1 megawatt of solar, you might be looking at 8 acres of land. Some people talk about land use and thinking about the installed capacity of projects. That's something good to keep in mind, because we do hear about land use considerations quite often. So let's go to the next slide. So this is a brief overview of how the Illinois RPS has supported wind, and there's 3 phases to this in the way that I've broken it down. There aren't 3 phases as called out by law, but I thought it was most useful to think about these changes against the backdrop of how the Illinois RPS has changed. The first is our original electricity procurement plans that were just done for default supply customer load. So I think everyone knows we're a retail choice state, and the vast majority of load is actually served by alternative retail electric suppliers and not by not by the utilities through default supply. And during this period, RECs were just procured under the RPS to meet default supply load. Back in 2010, the IPA conducted a procurement event and issued a series of bundled REC and energy long-term power purchase agreements, 20-year contracts where the developer sold both the RECs and energy to Illinois electric utilities to meet default supply load through the energy, with the RECs used toward the RPS. This is the only time we've done a bundled contract like this, and it was because the planning was just for default supply load, which isn't the case anymore under the Illinois RPS. The REC price was this imputed price with an increasing energy component associated with it. I think that's become zero either now or will be zero soon, but the energy component goes up year over year. Through that process, we supported 7 projects constituting just over 750 megawatts of new wind energy in Illinois. So you saw some of that from prior slides. Those contracts faced issues, though, as over time you would have potentially customers switching off of default supply service to retail electric supply service and no longer paying into the RPS to be able to support those contracts. That's one of the reasons, as we go to the next slide, why we ultimately moved toward a centralized approach. So moving, there we go. This is just a table of those projects that are supported through the 2010 LTPPAs, and you'll see the highlighted portion are projects that are outside of Illinois. So it's mostly within Illinois, but there was different language and statute then to support adjacent state projects, and those projects were supported. So go to the next slide. So phase 2 was post-FEJA. So the Future Energy Jobs Act passed in December of 2016, took effect June 2017, and brought all of the RPS compliance under one umbrella through planning done by the IPA. Through this, we went to a 25% by 2025 RPS for all customers, not just default supply customers. And our mechanism for supporting wind projects was through a competitive procurement event where bids were a REC price, just a REC price, through a forward procurement event. So if somebody bid $10 per REC, they got $10 per REC produced throughout the entirety of that contract. Through that, we supported 4 projects constituting 683 megawatts of new wind generation, but we heard a lot of challenges associated with that model. If you just have a fixed REC price, then you have exposure on behalf of the bidder to market conditions changing for the energy component of where the revenues were coming from. If they had a long-term power purchase agreement for that energy at a known price, maybe they wouldn't be as exposed to those market risks, but there aren't a lot of off-takers like that available in Illinois, or at least there weren't. As a consequence, they were often facing energy market risk. And we heard that moving to a model more like what New York had was actually preferable, the index REC model, which is what we have in place now. So move to the next slide. So this is just an overview of those projects that were then supported through that phase of the Illinois RPS. And going to phase 3 through the next slide. So the third phase is the phase that we have right now. And the first part of this, I think Ben might get into a little bit as part of his presentation, but now the bidder bids in a strike price, with the REC price constituting that strike price subtracted from an index price. And the index price is essentially a wholesale market energy settlement price. So if the seller is getting that wholesale market energy settlement price, then the REC price is the differential between the index price and the strike price, and they always have enough revenue to make them whole at that strike price. So it gives revenue certainty back to the project, which is something that we heard consistently was more important for having not just utility scale wind projects financed, but also utility scale solar projects as well. We've conducted 4 index REC procurement events to date, but we haven't had a lot of progress on getting wind projects support. We've supported a ton of new utility scale solar projects, but only 3 utility scale wind projects constituting 700 megawatts. So we're still trying to get more participation in the wind category. Right now, there's a balance of RPS, wind energy versus solar energy in the RPS that's set in statute. So that's something to think about is, does it make sense to have that same split if we're seeing much more interest in solar project development going forward? So right now we saw 26 utility scale solar projects we've been able to get contracts to and keeping everything on track there on the RPS, but we haven't seen the same sort of interest levels in wind project development. So going to the next slide. That's a table here then of those projects that have been supported through the index REC procurements that we've conducted since SEJA's passage in 2021 and where we are right now. And 2 of those, the results were just released yesterday of the results of that procurement event, and that's reflected on this slide. Let's go into the next slide. So a couple of things about going forward, challenges and solutions. Ben, in his next presentation, will talk about the market survey that NERA conducted on behalf of the IPA to try to survey developers as to what they need to make sure that Illinois is an attractive place for wind project development. RPS budget risks, which Sean mentioned, is a concern. With that index REC structure, REC prices float, and that means the budget impact associated with those REC prices change over time in very unpredictable ways. In times when wholesale prices are low, you might have a very high REC price and thus a very high budget hit. In times when wholesale electricity prices are high, you might actually have a very low REC price or potentially even a negative REC price, and that makes it very difficult to plan around. We outlined a lot of those challenges in Chapter 3 of our long-term plan and also in a budget release that we made in April of 2023. And that's probably the best document we've produced to outline how and why the RPS budget is unpredictable going forward, or the impacts of REC delivery contracts and their effect on it is unpredictable. Project attrition is also an issue. When you have fixed price bidding, you have a developer who's basically stuck at that price. If they bid in $70 as their strike price, then they get $70. If market conditions change substantially, they're still just getting $70. And that's something that we've got to figure out some way to solve for. In non-restructured states, this seems more straightforward. They recover based on the cost of developing the project, but that's not the model that we have here in Illinois. And then, as I mentioned previously, we're just seeing a lot more interest in developing solar projects than developing wind projects, a real flip of what we saw maybe 10 years ago. Go to the next slide. So a couple of recent bills of note to wrap up my presentation. Senate Bill 1474 was signed into law, and that adds modernized or retooled hydropower projects to the wind goals. That 45% is now not just wind, but also wind and these hydropower projects that would qualify as well. There's also an offshore wind bill that's been discussed quite a bit over the last few years. It would have us, or have the state, or have developers develop a wind project in Lake Michigan, delivering 700,000 RECs annually. To date, all we've seen is onshore wind in Illinois. This bill would provide a mechanism used to support an offshore project. I think it was first introduced probably May of 2021, has gone through different iterations since, but utilize that index REC structure. Then lastly, Senate Bill 1699 has us study both that offshore wind proposal and 2 other proposals, including a large-scale battery storage procurement plan and procurement process, plus some other battery storage policies, and a large-scale HVDC transmission line. We'll be wrapping up that study by March 1st, 2024. So hopefully it will guide policy decisions made in the upcoming legislative session this spring. And then there's also been cleanup, or there was cleanup to the January 2023 siting bill as part of Senate Bill 1699 as well. I know Chris will get into some of the effects of the siting bill and how it looks like from a developer's perspective, but that has just been signed into law just recently. So that's what's happened in the General Assembly most recently that impacts wind project development in Illinois. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Megha, who will go to Ben next.
Yes, thank you, Brian. Our next speaker is Ben Chi. Ben will be discussing the IPA procurement process and market trends for utility scale wind and REC contracts. Ben, the floor is yours.
Hey, thank you. Can we turn the slides, please? Yeah, how about the next one? And the next one? All right, so I'll start here. So first of all, Mega and the IPA, thanks for having me on this call and with you on this panel to discuss about wind through the procurements. So for this next section, I will talk about the RFP process and some thoughts about what is going on regarding participation in the wind category in contrast to the robust participation we are seeing in the solar category. So since CEJA had passed back in September of 2021, we have held 4 rounds of index REC procurements. The results of these procurements can be found on our website. And in the 4 rounds of the procurement, we have awarded contracts for 25 utility-scale solar projects, 9 brownfield site photovoltaic projects, but only 3 wind projects. So this is accounting also for the procurement that just concluded yesterday. And these procurements are not separate procurements for these different types of technologies, but are procurements for wind and solar concurrently. So there is a 2-part process. The first part is really for bidders to provide information to qualify the project. And the second part is for these projects that have been qualified to put up pre-bid security to support the bids. If you look at the timeline, it takes about 4 months when we first start with the stakeholder engagement process to get the feedback on the contracts to when contracts are signed. So there's a period of about 4 months from beginning to end. And then once the bids are submitted, you're looking at around 10 days when contracts must be executed. So the quick turnaround is intended by designers in the law. It is to bring certainty to bidders. There is no lengthy negotiation period, and this departs, I know, from many other jurisdictions where developers are, where the approval process could take months after bid submission. Over on the next slide. So here, I'll talk a little bit about the qualification requirements. The requirements here for utility scale wind and solar, they are fairly similar and very basic. So the project must be greater than 5 megawatts, must be in Illinois or an adjacent state, and they must be new. The only substantive qualification requirement you'll find that on the right is really for bidders to demonstrate site control. And they can do that either through some lease or easement agreement between the developer and the landowner, or provide what we call these system impact studies from the ISO, PJM or MISO, and interconnection agreement. So for the developer to request for these impact studies with the ISO would have already had to confirm that the developer has secured the needed land to develop the project. So for us to ask for these studies or the interconnection agreement is really for us to get at the question whether the developer has secured adequate site control for project development. And that's really the main, and if not only, maturity, viability criteria that we are looking for. Over on the next slide. So when a project has qualified, then the bid process will ask for a couple of items. First, a strike price, which is really a bundled price for both energy and RECs. So here, the conceptual question we are asking is how much does it cost you to develop your project and then to operate and maintain it for a 20-year term? You can estimate what your production would be over the 20-year term once your project is operational. Just let us know what that strike price is to ensure that you have enough to build your project and to operate and maintain it for a 20-year term. So that's sort of basically the concept of the strike price that we are after. We'll ask you for a full quantity and a minimum quantity, basically the commitment in terms of the quantity that you are bringing in for this contract. The minimum quantity is only in case you are the marginal bidder, and we can award you some but not all of the quantity that you have proposed. And then the last item here is really for you to give us the or elect the index hub. And in the law, in CEJA, you are allowed to specify one of 2 hubs, either the PJM NI hub, the Northern Illinois hub, or the MISO Illinois hub. So those are the two hubs that you're electing. You're electing these hubs for purposes of price and payment calculations under the contract. This is a contract for difference, so we need to know what the index hub is so that we can calculate the difference between your strike price and the hourly price at the index hub. On the next slide, please. So when bids are received, evaluation will be for each category, wind and solar separately, so that the wind bids are not competing with the solar bids and vice versa. There is a confidential benchmark that is developed by us, the procurement administrator, in consultation with the procurement monitor and the IPA, and that is filed and approved by the Illinois Commerce Commission. Only bids that meet or beat the benchmark will be considered, and selection preferences are provided mainly through strike price adjustments in two scenarios. So one, if the project has committed to a greater equity standard, where you have more equity eligible contractors or persons in your project workforce. Or two, if your project is proposed to be sited in an energy transition community grant area. So in one of these two cases or both cases, what we'll do is we'll discount your strike price so that it looks more competitive in the evaluation process. But this discount will not affect your payment. This is basically a discount of your strike price for purposes of evaluation. And then the evaluation basically ranks and select projects based on the lowest strike price or adjusted strike price first until we hit the procurement target. Slide, the next slide, the next one, slide 40, thank you. Yep. So to help us, the procurement administrator, understand the barriers to participation, we did a few things. So taking the past solicitation as an example, we started the process back in mid-August when we held a comment process to seek input from stakeholders on just the contract provisions and RFP requirements to see if there are anything in those documents, those requirements that would be prohibitive or unattractive to developers. Then we reviewed reports and data from a wide range of sources, including the Berkeley Lab, the Department of Energy, and other industry reports, just to understand if there are reasons that may help explain why we are seeing so few wind projects participating in our procurements. And then we went online to identify renewable developers with projects in the pipeline. And we called all of them, or as many as we could identify, to inform us about the index REC landscape. And these calls were really there, first and foremost, inform them about the opportunity. And really through these calls, we gained some insight into the perspective of developers, what they like about the opportunity, what they did not like about the opportunity. We did not just speak to one or two developers, we spoke with many developers during the course of this time. And over the next slide, please. So what we have uncovered a few interesting things, and the next few slides will try to uncover that here in this presentation. So first, what we found is that there are some misconceptions in the developer community about the IPA procurement. This is covered on the right. So several developers thought that the offering is really just a REC delivery contract only. And while that is true, they failed to see that through the index REC structure, we are essentially mimicking a bundled energy and REC contract. So this is a huge issue because the entire design of this index REC mechanism is to ensure developers have certainty on the revenues from both the energy and the RECs from the project. So between the utility and the ISO, PJM or MISO, the conceptual promise is that we will make developers whole at the strike price that they name. The strike price is the strike price they name to tell us that is what it takes to build the project, where it is located, and then to operate and maintain it for a 20-year term. The second point we note is many developers have incorrectly understood the procurement is for projects in Illinois only. This is not true. Projects in Illinois and 6 other states that are adjoining Illinois are also eligible under the law. but they do need to pass the public interest criteria if they are an adjacent state project. And then there are those, I think, bidders that I would say understood that the project in adjacent states are eligible, but have these misconception that the adjacent state projects are disadvantaged in the evaluation process, which is not true. If it is an adjacent state project, it is eligible, then the evaluation treats these projects no differently than projects in Illinois. And then I think the other barrier here on geography is probably a perceived barrier. We spoke with developers, and what we sense is that they often talk themselves out of participating in the RFP if they have an adjacent state project, because they think they would not pass the public interest criteria, or that there is a long, protracted, onerous process to get these adjacent state projects to be considered. This is not true. The IPA has a streamlined process to evaluate these projects. And what I often tell developers is simply fill out the form. The form will ask you for basic information about your project and the location, and then let the IPA tell you whether your project passes the public interest criteria or not, rather than talking yourself out of the opportunity. The IPA takes about 2 days or 3 days to get back to you once you submit the application. It takes very little time for them to evaluate whether it passes the public interest criteria or not. So if you're listening on this webcast here, don't talk yourself out of the opportunity. If you have a project that is out of state, do submit it to the IPA and let them decide whether it passes the public interest criteria or not. And then on the left side, something interesting we uncovered is that there is a non-insignificant number of developers that knew about the competitive procurements because they are approved vendors in the Illinois Shines and ILSFR, or Illinois Solar for All programs. These programs are the IPA programs, but they are targeted for community solar development and smaller solar projects. This tells us a few things, I think. So this tells us that there is some spillover effects regarding participation in those programs. Those programs are like incubating environments where they allow developers to take baby steps, to learn about the requirements, to understand the local permitting requirements, gain an understanding of site control, develop the local staff in Illinois, and then to familiarize themselves with Illinois labor and equity requirements, which are also in the competitive procurements. So there's a whole body of work out there that talks about these learning economies in procurement economics. I think these other programs allow developers to start small, to learn, and then to really scale big. So the takeaway here is this: there is no analogous programs for wind developers. These programs only for solar developers. And the other thing is the economics of developing wind, I think, just do not allow for wind developers to be small, to start small, and then to scale up. Over on the next slide, please. Thank you. So on this next slide and the one after, I think we'll touch on some of the development-related elements that are unique to developing wind projects and how they affect participation in the RFP. So first, we need to understand that it takes time between when a developer makes an entry decision to want to develop a project in Illinois or the adjacent state, and to when the developer will actually show up in our procurement. Site control itself is an eligibility requirement. You take that as an example. The developer that hears about the opportunity will have to invest time and then has to go to the plot of land to scout out a place for the project, speak to the landowner or the farmer, ascertain the interest of the landowner, and negotiate a contract. So these things take time. So for solar projects, the requirement for us in the RFP is 4 acres per megawatt. For wind, it is 10 times that, which is 40 acres per megawatt. I know in Brian's slide, you saw on page 24, I took down some notes there earlier, that he was having a rule of thumb of 8 acres per megawatt for solar and 80 acres per megawatt for wind projects. It's the same here, except for our procurement. We actually brought it halfway down to what the industry would require. But in general, site control is not the only maturity milestone developers have to hit. We don't require more than site control, but developers themselves will have internal project maturity milestones before they will look for offtake opportunities. Many developers will only participate in a competitive procurement after they have completed a system impact study, something like a DPP3 in MISO, or receive an interconnection agreement. The reason is simple. Interconnection cost is a significant cost component, and the actual cost can vary a lot from the initial estimate. So developers really want to be sure that they have most of the big ticket items known before they come to the RFP. Makes a lot of sense. You cannot really submit a price offer that is binding, especially in relative short order after you submit your qualifications, if you don't have a lot of these project maturity milestones met. So on this slide here, we know from the data that it currently takes about 3 to 5 years to complete a DPP3 study in MISO. And looking back 3 to 5 years ago, what it shows us is there was a steep decline in projects entering the interconnection queue in 2019 and 2020 period. This is due to the decline in the PTC value and the uncertainty about the extension of the PTC then. If it is true that projects cannot bid in an RFP unless they have some of these DPP studies done, then the participation that we are seeing in our procurement for wind may just be a reflection of the delayed impact from the 2019-2020 slowdown of the wind projects entering into the queue. This is observed for wind, but as you can see, not for solar in that same period. So interestingly enough, I think even with the IRA in 2022, there are a lot more new applications for solar than wind nationally. And it's the same story that you see here in Illinois. Over on the next slide, please. So some of the key takeaways are these. So first, it takes time. There is more time needed upfront to develop wind and solar. Site control alone requires more time. The second thing is, once you enter into the interconnection queue with an application request, wind projects suffers disproportionately than solar projects when it comes to interconnection delays. Currently, there are significant delays in PJM and MISO. Delays in PJM are so bad that many developers we spoke with tell us that they have exited PJM projects or development altogether. And if you look at MISO's website, the official document will say that it takes about 17 months to get through the interconnection queue. That's the diagram you see here. But the reality is that it takes about 3 to 5 years to complete a DPP3 study from the time of the request. So what is relevant here for wind is that if you have a wind project, you would take about 6 months longer on average to go through these interconnection studies. So with higher upfront costs, disproportionate delays affecting wind developers, this makes us suspect that earlier offtake commitments may be more important for wind developers and solar developers. And if we are right, and if they are looking for offtake opportunities earlier in the development cycle, this will probably only be through the voluntary markets, given price is rigid after the RFP award. The next slide, please. So I will kind of walk through key points here in the next slide and we'll end off. So here on this slide, we have tried to confirm some things about the voluntary market. And I think what we are hearing very loud and clear is that the voluntary market is thriving. You've heard that from Sean, you have seen that from Brian as well in the earlier presentations. So one thing I will point out is that since 2017, when we consider the projects that are legally new under seizure or in Illinois law, there are 19 projects energized in Illinois, many of them not supported by the Illinois RPS. If we look forward, at this time, we see about 15 projects in late stage, DPP3 and after, not yet energized, and they already have PPAs signed with commercial off-takers. So the implications of this is, if wind developers are looking for earlier off-take commitments, and they have already secured commitments in earlier stages, then they may not show up in our procurements, given the offtake need is already filled earlier on. The only item I want to highlight on the top of this slide here is probably that comparing projects in Illinois and adjacent states awarded by the IPA versus the voluntary market is a skewed comparison and less meaningful. If you're a wind developer looking for opportunities in the voluntary market, you would develop your project wherever it makes most commercial or economic sense to do so. So anywhere in the 50 United States and beyond, that's our competition from the procurement administrator's perspective. Leadership campaigns such as RE100 are looking at US and Canada as a single market. So I'll end off on slide 45, the next slide, please, with just our conclusion. So I see two sets of issues here. So the first set of issues are issues that affect wind development nationally or nationwide, such as interconnection delays affecting wind and probably disproportionately affecting wind more than solar. These issues cannot be resolved by the IPA. The second part of this on the right what I would say, a recognition that we have a real thriving voluntary market that is competing for bidder interest. And here we will need to ensure on the IPA and the procurement administrator side that we do all we can to make sure that the product offering is competitive and attractive to developers to want to participate in our RFP and to develop in Illinois and the adjacent states. We have to ensure developers understand correctly the value of the opportunity and the requirements. We will facilitate learning as much as possible. And given the timing when people enter into the market and when they come to our procurement, we will try to provide information about procurement cadence and some indication of future RFP schedule. I think that is what we have heard to be important from developers. I'll end off by just saying that it will take time before we see significant improvement in wind participation, but we are optimistic about this, given the developments that we're seeing. And with that, I will turn the time back to Megha. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Our last speaker of the session is Chris Kunkel. Chris will be highlighting Illinois' position for wind energy from a developer's perspective. Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thanks to the IPA for having me on this very informative webinar. So I'm going to walk through a couple things in this short deck. First, background for everybody to better understand Apex's presence in the state of Illinois. Information that looks at similar to what Sean and Ben talked about in terms of kind of broader industry-wide pressures that we're seeing right now. Then a little bit about how we think a developer like Apex thinks about the state of Illinois, and then to Brian's point, a little bit of commentary on the siting reform law that passed earlier this year. So if you could go to the next slide, I will. This is a list of the 5 projects that Apex has built in the state of Illinois. 2 of these actually have IPA contracts. Sugar Creek Wind was listed in one of Brian's slides, I believe, as an older contract and same round as Mulligan Solar. And then the map on the right just shows all of our projects that are, in addition to the operational projects that are in the development process. As you can see, Apex is very bullish on Illinois, and I can talk a little bit more about why that is. But just want to use this as an opportunity to reinforce something that hasn't really been said yet. But if and when all of these projects get built, we are talking about billions of dollars of investment in rural Illinois. Hundreds of millions of dollars in money in tax revenue that's going to schools, payments to landowners, thousands of union construction jobs that are being created. So this is a real economic driver throughout the state of Illinois. But in the next slide, I will again talk about some of these cost pressures that we as an industry are trying to wrestle with. So Sean mentioned we started to see real increases in the supply, on the supply side of things, that started with COVID, supply chain constraints, price increases on raw materials, a backlog of utility scale grid equipment, so transformers, substation equipment, things like that, that we need in order to interconnect our facilities with existing grid infrastructure. Cost of capital has been a major driver of this as well. These are very capital intensive projects, right? Once you build a project, there's very limited ongoing O&M costs or fuel costs. So it's very much an upfront investment that is very dependent on how much it costs to borrow $400 million to build a project. And then I won't dive too far, much deeper on the transmission congestion and basis risk and interconnection delays and all of that. But that has certainly been a driving factor on the cost side. But we've also seen the market respond to this, I think, in a couple of different ways. Many buyers, particularly on the voluntary corporate side of things, have aggressive sustainability goals. And if you're a big enough company with a big enough balance sheet and your board is saying, hey, meet your sustainability goals, they're still going to go out and procure projects. They're still going to, as Ben was talking about, start the negotiation process earlier, be willing to share risk with the developer from a development standpoint, be much more flexible than we've seen before. And again, I can kind of talk a little bit more about the implications of that for the IPA, but largely agree with everything that Ben said from a competitive standpoint. But we've also seen other buyers, moving to other markets or reducing or slowing their procurement of renewable energy. And some of this has been offset by increases in wholesale electric prices and overall REC prices. And then we've also seen some evolution just in turbine technology in the last couple of years with much larger turbines. We are going to be moving into construction for a project next year in Illinois that will be using 6 megawatt machines. That is, 2 to 3 times larger than what we've used in the past for many of those existing operational wind farms that you saw on the list earlier. So that helps drive down cost for a variety of different reasons. So just and again, going back to the market response thing, we've also seen the IPA respond to that in terms of yesterday's announcement, a higher average REC price or strike price rather. So buyers, whether it's on the IPA side, buyers on the utility side in regulated states, or buyers on the commercial corporate side of things, are all adjusting to this new reality that we're in. So despite that, and moving on to the next slide, companies like Apex are still super bullish on Illinois. One is it's a fantastic wind resource. You look at the map of the wind corridor across the United States. This is as good as the wind gets anywhere east of the Mississippi River in a couple of different corridors in the state. So it's a great opportunity from a cost standpoint and economic standpoint, both for the state, but also for export opportunities to other markets where wind is not as cost effective. You have plenty of willing landowners. This has not been a problem for us signing leases. There are ample folks out there in rural Illinois that want to be able to host these projects. They view it as a way to preserve their agricultural operations. Brian's point about land use is an important one in terms of the overall size of the project, but unlike solar, agricultural operations don't really change much with wind. And so that makes it very appealing for certain landowners who want to sort of supplement their existing operations. So check that box. Again, access to transmission. We've talked a little bit about that. Sean has, in terms of Illinois sitting at this intersection of MISO and PJM, being able to sell into different markets, and then everything that's going on with MISO transmission expansion through Tranche 1 and Tranche 2, and all of the work that's gone into the renewable energy access plan. We have confidence as a developer that there's good infrastructure today and good market today, but there's also more coming, which is going to be important from a long-term operational standpoint of one of these projects. Permitting regime couldn't be more important. That is a huge risk for projects in other states. You look at a state like Indiana or Iowa, where these projects are permitted wholly at the local level and without much oversight by the state. And it is a major deterrent when we as a developer can secure 30,000, 40,000, 50,000 acres of land, do all of our environmental permitting, find a customer, find transmission interconnection, have a ready to go project under an existing ordinance, and then a county or a township changes the rules at the very last minute. We can be millions of dollars deep into a project at that point, and without any real recourse when that happens. So that can be a major frustration. And that's no longer the case in Illinois with as a result of the siting reform law, which again I'll talk more about in a minute. And then the last thing is the market demand, right? So a very aggressive RPS in Illinois, very robust corporate demand in terms of companies with major operations in the state that have these sustainability goals. And to Brian and Ben's point, like the transition from fixed price RECs to index price RECs. That's very appealing from a development perspective. That helps keep us whole. That helps with financing down the road, and that was a very important change, along with some of the other changes that the IPA made just in the last post CEJA world. The whole concept of a bid adjustment mechanism is super enticing. Better flexibility around the contract itself, coupled with COD or REC delivery. But that's going to continue to be something that in order to ensure success of the RPS and facilitate more wind development in the state, that is contracting with the IPA, like continued work to make sure that the IPA's process is just as, if not more appealing than the corporate market. That's going to be really important for the IPA to continue to evolve and work on. So moving on to, and you can go past this one as well. So this is just a reminder, I guess, that from our perspective, we see the siting reform law as truly unlocking the potential of CEJA from a development standpoint. The map on the right shows kind of what we looked at. This was before the permitting reform law, but you can see that several of the highest wind resource counties effectively outlawed wind energy, right? And this is done through a number of different mechanisms, through ordinances and so forth. And so the change that the General Assembly made to establish statewide standards that are based on best practices and allow counties to continue to sort of implement that, we believe that restores landowner rights. Folks that want to be able to host these projects were being told by their local government that that was illegal. They couldn't do that. And again, keeps that local process. Certainly, there are implementation challenges with this, as there are with any type of legislation that sort of changes, that the state enacts, that changes how locals process some type of land use or zoning policy. We're seeing some immediate benefits of this, projects that were in a situation that I kind of described, where they were fully baked projects in compliance with the law, with the local ordinance, and the local government still denied the project or changed the ordinance at the last minute. Those types of projects are now have a more clear path forward. But most of the benefit from our perspective will be felt 3 to 5 years from now. And this ties back to Ben's point around timelines for an interconnection queue, the time it takes to do environmental studies, to do land leasing activities, all of that. that this is opening up whole new portions of the state that had previously been effectively off limits for wind development. And these are areas that, again, are in the highest wind resource of the state, meaning more cost-effective energy, more cost-effective RECs for ultimate RPS compliance. So that's the end of my presentation. Glad to take any Q&A. And again, really appreciate the IPA for having me on today.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks to all the speakers for sharing such valuable insights on wind energy nationally and locally with information on barriers and opportunities. I know we're slightly behind, so I just want to take this one question that came when Brian was presenting. This question is from Deborah Williams. Where are we at today in relation to the 40% RPS goal by 2040?
So this is actually kind of a challenging question to answer for a couple of reasons that I'll get into. But number one, I would point you to Chapter 3 of the long-term plan that we filed with the Illinois Commerce Commission in October, that has tables and charts that show essentially where our progress is. I want to say somewhere between 10 and 12% right now. But number two is that a procurement event like yesterday's procurement event actually has a pretty big impact on progress as to where we are under the Illinois RPS. And every week or 2 weeks, there are contracts being sent to the Illinois Commerce Commission for approval that does as well. And sometimes they'll contain a number of community solar projects, which has kind of a big uptick increase. So that number is constantly changing with each approval. But something like yesterday's procurement event, where we're facilitating the development of over a gigawatt of new wind and solar projects, will have an impact. And we haven't done the analysis of where we are exactly after that procurement event yet. So Chapter 3 of the long-term plan, you can find that in the IPA's website, is the best place to look for different tables and charts around RPS progress, but keep in mind that it may not be exactly up to date.
Thanks, Brian. With that, I do want to invite our, again, Acting Director Brian Granahan to provide some updates on 2023 IPA accomplishments and key 2024 initiatives.
Sure, thanks, Mega. So we've got a few slides here just to talk about some of the stuff the IPA did over the last year and what to expect in the year ahead. I think there's a lot of people who probably come to these power hours or interact with the agency around a discrete lane of our work, but there's a lot of different things that we do. So I thought it'd be very useful to give an overview of some of the big things that we've done over the past year, but then also talk about what to expect in the next year, whether there's big projects coming up that might impact you in ways you didn't think of, or you might have ideas about things that we should be doing that you hear something in this presentation that just come to mind because you say, well, that'd be a great thing for the IPA to take on. So this just breaks down month by month, different accomplishments and events over the past year. I think a few things that I want to highlight out of this list is, number one, the launch of our energy equity portal. It's an energyequity.illinois.gov. It allows has a platform that allows for EEPs to be matched with clean energy development companies that have to meet the minimum equity standard. It also has robust maps that show where equity investment eligible communities actually are, combining our environmental justice community maps and the R3 maps to build out a map with different customized overlays to show exactly where those EIEC communities are. So that's something that's great that we've launched. And we've tried to build that out over time and add new resources to that site, including information about training programs, for instance. And the long-term vision is for that page to be more of a hub for discussion and requirements related to equity initiatives in clean energy. So this is something that was a big lift across a number of different staff members at the agency. We're really thankful that we got it up and running, and we're thankful for the different improvements that we've been able to make to it since. Another item I want to highlight is our RPS budget update role, as there's a lot of different scenario planning that we tried to do there. Through that budget update, a lot of the risks for the RPS budget going forward were talked about through prior presentations today, and we tried to use that budget update as a way to underscore that if you make just some minor assumptions over here, the RPS budget is more than sufficient to meet RPS goals. But if you make some different assumptions, it might just be a 2 to 5% change to where you see trends in energy prices, or where you see trends in administratively set REC prices, or whatever it might be. Suddenly you end up with a very different outcome. And hopefully that budget update is very useful to stakeholders in understanding risks and thinking about different policy alternatives to the current system. We also launched our power brief in April. I don't know that everybody on this call necessarily knows that we do this, but we have a customized newsletter that goes out to legislators, legislative staff, the governor's office, and others, containing different highlights of the past month of the IPA's work. So we're trying to give more visibility into the different things that we do, and that's one of the many initiatives that we've done in order to be able to do this. Then looking ahead to June, we hired a deputy director and our chief DEI officer. We're really trying to grow and expand as an agency. If I go back to 5 years ago when we first moved into these agencies' offices, I think we had a staff of like 8 or 9. Now we're up over 40 employees. We have 6 different bureaus. We're trying to grow and make sure that we can meet the ambitious challenges that we're faced with through new staff and more specialization. So as we go to the next page. On the next slide, there we go. So just a few other things too to talk about from 2023, including the launch of 2 different Illinois Solar for All pilot programs. We're trying to figure out different ways to get more participation in the residential portion of the Solar for All program. And these pilot initiatives are ways for us to take a different approach to trying to get more customers in, solving for different barriers. We obviously filed our annual electricity procurement plan in September, and that was just recently approved by the ICC. And then one of the biggest things that we did this year is develop our 2024 long-term renewable resources procurement plan that was filed with the commission in October. We had stakeholder comment processes all summer around that, and then published a draft plan for comment in August, received comments at the end of September, revised that plan for filing in October, and that's currently being litigated before the ICC in docket number 23-074-0714. So a lot of different proposals in there that reflect where we see things going on RPS compliance in the coming years. A few other items I want to highlight as well. One is the launch of our Illinois Shines mentorship program to try to assist EECs that may be new to the space, equity eligible contractors that may be new to the space. And then also our Illinois Solar for All program won a National Sunny Award this November. We're a grand prize winner. We got a big $10,000 novelty check by virtue of recognition of the work that's been done in the Illinois Solar for All program. So certainly want to credit Jen Schmidt and people at Elevate who are responsible for that program, as they've done great work, and we were able to receive national recognition around Illinois Solar for All. Please go to the next slide. This is just a listing of the different power hours that we've had across 2023. And if you have ideas for power hours you want us to take on in 2024, please don't hesitate to send them to Mega or I. But it gives you some sense of the types of issues that we've tried to bring speakers together on and have a good discussion on using the IPA as a platform. Hopefully these are educational and beneficial to the audiences that they serve. We know a lot of people will go and access the archive Power Hour presentations and watch them after the fact to try to become more familiar on the issue. So if there's a certain issue of interest that you think would be really helpful for us to cover in 2024, don't hesitate to reach out. Oftentimes we're just trying to kind of look at the landscape and see what some of the big issues are, and then design a power hour accordingly, try to do it a couple of months in advance. And these are the ones that we came to in 2023 as being important enough to have a presentation like the presentation that we had today on wind energy. So looking ahead to 2024, let's go to the next slide. So what comes up for the IPA in the next few months? Well, one is that we're releasing our annual report on February 15th. This is a report that we're required to release by law. And over the years, it's been very dry, kind of compliance oriented, and it has some somewhat useful facts and information in it, but we're trying to reconceive of that annual report and provide information that we think might be beneficial to more general audiences. So it'll still have all the same items that it had before in it, but we're trying to figure out a way to create different data visualizations or provide more narrative content or provide better statistics to make that annual report more useful and something that someone who might read our long-term plan also sees value in us releasing. Talked a little bit in my presentation about the policy study that we've been asked to do now under Senate Bill 1699, which was just recently signed into law. 3 different policies being analyzed across a number of different qualitative criteria, with the IPA providing an assessment of those policies through its policy study. The draft is due to be released January 22nd. Comments on the draft February 12th, and then the final version comes out March 1st. And our thought is that, okay, once the policy study is released, now that sets the stage for more intensive legislative discussions around the proposals that we've been asked to assess. And then our 2024 long-term plan, that's before the ICC presently. The final order is due out February 20th. By and large, that's requirements for the upcoming program years in our programs, or the 2 years that maybe start in the middle of the next year. Our next set of index rec procurements are also scheduled through that long-term plan. So you'll see at the bottom, it says probably be restarting those this summer. So the procurement event for which results were released yesterday, we'd be restarting those sometime this summer. In our long-term plan, we just tend to refer to the timeline seasonally because scheduling those things is a function of a number of different factors, and having a firm date ahead of time hasn't worked out well. That's something we've learned over the years. So, year 2 of our self-direct program is also set to kick off this spring with crediting beginning June 1st. So we'll see if we see a new cohort of additional customers into that program. And then, of course, new program years for Illinois Shines, the Illinois Solar for All program. That'll be kicking off over the summer as well, or June for Illinois Shines. June 1st is when that program opens up. So those are some big things coming up, some different milestone events that we have on the immediate horizon in the next 6 months or so. So go to the next slide. So talked a little bit about the policy study and just wanted to unpack this for those who aren't familiar with it. There's 3 different things that we're being asked to study. One is a storage procurement plan and associated storage policies found in Senate Bill 1587. Another is a procurement process around an offshore wind project where we'd be getting, or the Illinois Electric Utilities will be delivered 700,000 RECs annually from a new offshore wind project at, I believe, about 150 megawatts in size in Lake Michigan. Then the third is the HVDC's the Sioux Green Line that's been proposed to move electricity from Iowa into the PJM portion of Illinois through an HVDC line that would run underground on a railroad easement, and assessing that policy. We've developed a policy study page on our agency's website to share information, and we've conducted a few different stakeholder comment processes as well, received good feedback back from stakeholders. Now we're getting modeling results back from our subcontractors who are doing some of the modeling associated with the policy study. And it's up to us over the next 5 weeks before releasing the draft policy study to get all of the narrative content done. So that's something to look out for from the IPA in mid-January, is the release of the draft of our policy study. And then I want to go into the next slide. A really ambitious project that's been something that Megha Hamal and Matt Kuzma at our agency have been working on, and a whole team working for them as well, is our Clean Energy Dashboard project. So the most common question we tend to receive at the IPA is something along the lines of, well, how much, what we had today, how much wind energy is there in Illinois? How much solar is there in Illinois? How many projects might be in this particular county? Where are we in terms of solar as a component of the overall generation mix? And what we've decided is important to do is to try to basically harness all of these different data sets together that contains this information, because they're also oftentimes found in diffuse areas. The IPA doesn't get all of this inherently. Sometimes we have to go searching through tracking systems or through EIA data or other databases in order to get it. Bring those data sets together and then use data visualization tools to try to tell the story of renewable energy development in Illinois in a way that's more accessible and more engaging than just bare charts and stats. Now, we'll have those charts and stats, but we're also trying to find novel ways to visualize those things and allow users to engage with the dashboard in a way that allows them to create their own visualizations. And I've got a few slides that highlight the sort of work that we're looking to do here. So let's go to the next slide. This is basically another way of looking at the share of capacity through the Illinois Shines program. You can see broken down by community solar versus super generation, and then projects under development by different categories. You can create visualizations that show this as part of a 360-degree whole and tell a story that might not be as apparent through the data. So, for example, you have all of these super generation projects that have been energized, and you have all of these community solar projects that are still under development working toward energization. If you're looking at this information in a spreadsheet, that might not be quite as obvious. But when you can create visualization tools like this, you start to tell more of a story. And what's exactly happening on the ground with clean energy development becomes more clear. So that's part of the ambition of this project, is to tell that story more effectively through visualization tools. So go to the next slide. This is another slide that kind of gets toward the same end, which is racial and ethnic information about equity eligible persons who registered through our portal. Again, they can come in and register through our portal, EEPs can, and then make themselves known to clean energy development companies that might want to hire equity eligible persons in order to meet the minimum equity standard. They can also learn about different training programs that are available, not just those from DCEO or those that were available previously, but also other training resources that we put in the site. And this is a way to visualize exactly what the breakdown is of equity eligible persons found in the equity portal. Again, it's something that there's a lot of interest in the underlying information, but maybe there's a better way to visualize it and a more engaging way to visualize it. And that's part of what our Clean Energy Dashboard is attempting to tackle. So go to the next slide. And lastly, this is some information on both the age of the head of household and household income for Illinois Solar for All income verifications. And again, it's a way to kind of plot information. This is a large data set, as you see by all the different circles associated with it. And then you can see the different toggles on the right-hand side. So if you just wanted to know community solar, you could toggle that off. If you just wanted to know small distributed generation, you could toggle that off. And then you can see through the color exactly what method was used for income verification. Just an example of the types of things that we can unlock in taking the data sets that we're sitting on and bringing professionals in to say, okay, how can we better visualize this, or how can we be better public servants by providing more engaging content or content that tells a better story? So that's where we see this is a big project being undertaken by the IPA. Ideally, the first versions of the dashboard will be up maybe 3 to 4 months from now. We're working toward, I think, March of 2024. But it's something that we feel is very important to provide visibility into all of the work that goes on at the agency and items that are of real interest to the public. Let's go to the last slide. So a few additional items for 2024. One is just the continued growth of the Illinois Power Agency. As we get more responsibilities, whether it's conceiving of the clean energy space in more qualitative ways, through equity requirements and labor requirements, we're continuing to build our team out to make sure that we can manage those efforts. A big part of that is that we established a Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Bureau in 2023, and building up the staff of that bureau with new capacity is one of the big priorities for 2024. Additionally, adding more specialization and expertise will be very important to our agency. And very pleased by the fact that we've been able to hire technical experts in certain areas, like Chandra Mittal, who joined the agency this fall. She comes in with a renewable energy finance background that we didn't have previously. And I think we have to have more specialization going forward to tackle the ambition of some of the tasks that we've been tasked with. New office space. So we're planning on moving offices. Right now, where I am is 105 West Madison, and we hope to be at 180 North Wabash by sometime this summer. The Procurement Policy Board of the state met yesterday and approved our lease. So ideally now the next steps are building out that space. And hopefully many of you who are stakeholders who have an interest in the agency's work will be meeting us at some point at our new offices in the next year. We hope to continue to contribute to legislative discussions. We know there'll be a lot of big ticket items up next year. The policy study is kind of our first entree into that world. And we're also pivoting towards seeking federal funding and also being more engaged in intrastate, cross-state agency, and interstate initiatives. We have worked with the Illinois Finance Authority on an application for a greenhouse gas reduction fund funding federally. And we'll be hosting the Clean Energy States Alliance's annual meetings in conjunction with CESA this June. There's 2 tracks to that meeting. One is for energy storage, one is for equity in the energy space. But those meetings bring together representatives of state agencies like ours that work on clean energy issues nationwide, and Chicago will be the host of those meetings in 2024, so we're very excited about that. We're also oftentimes doing RFQ, RFP processes for different consultants. This year it will be our procurement planning consultant. That RFQ, RFP process will be up as the term of that contract is starting to end. And we will continue to develop more public-facing media and content to be more engaging in line with some of the dashboard work that I described earlier. So we're always looking for different ways to try to build a better bridge out when it comes to our work. So that's just some vision of what's to come for the IPA in the next year. If you have any ideas on big projects you think we need to take on, don't hesitate to reach out. And here, Mega has the contact information for all the different speakers at today's Power Hour. And I really thank everybody for their time. Certainly thank the speakers for their time, but also thank our staff and others for their time and all the attendees. You know, it's the holidays again, and thank you so much for attending today.
Thanks, Brian. Again, thank to all our speakers and attendees for joining the session. We will see you at our next webinar, which will be taking place in February 2024. Have a great holiday.